Hello and welcome to The Virus. I'm Norman Swan. In a moment, the scramble to develop a vaccine to protect us against all variants. And zero COVID in China. China is desperately trying to hold on to its policy of severely and quickly clamping down on any COVID outbreak. But it's crippling the economy. Rolling lockdowns and scenes of chaos. Under Shanghai's strict virus control regulations, IKEA was immediately locked down after reports health authorities had discovered that a close contact of an infected child had visited the store. It sent shoppers scurrying to the exits. Vivian Wang is a China correspondent for the New York Times, and she joins us now from Beijing. Welcome to The Virus, Vivian. Thanks for joining us. So, how much impact are these COVID lockdowns having on the economy in China? Can we quantify it?
The GDP numbers that China has posted recently and over the course of this year are far below their originally stated target of 5% GDP growth this year. And top officials have been quite clear about the fact that they are concerned about economic growth, which is not necessarily something that you hear from the top leaders in Beijing. And just walking around on the streets, you see shuttered restaurants, you see shuttered shops. Unemployment for young people, 18 to 24, is at record highs. So people are really feeling the pain of these policies.
What are the political ramifications? Because Xi is up for re-election at the end of the year.
Obviously, if the government cannot improve the economy, that will have a real effect on the trust that people have in the government. So much of the governing pact that the party has offered to its people for so many decades is political obedience in exchange for economic growth. So that is definitely top of mind for leaders. They don't want to see any sort of social instability, especially ahead of this important party congress later this year, as you mentioned, when she is expected to easily claim a third term.
What's the way out of this for China? I mean, they've got vaccines that are not terribly effective. They've probably under-immunized the over 60s. They don't want to accept, presumably, Western vaccines. How do they get out of it?
You know, that's the question that we're all asking ourselves. If they really want to improve trade, they want to improve the economic numbers, that will require a certain amount of loosening. But they've done a really good job propaganda-wise, messaging-wise, in keeping a lot of people quite scared of the virus itself. And so even if they do decide that they would like to loosen, it will require a certain amount of messaging and work by the government to allow the public to accept that kind of change in policy direction. And then, as you mentioned, there are all the logistics of continuing to boost elderly vaccination rates, of making sure that medical facilities are up to par so that when inevitably people do get infected after they reopen, the hospitals are not overwhelmed. So a lot of that preparatory work is really just not in place yet.
Does the public trust the government?
It's really hard to ever say exactly anything precise about Chinese public opinion because there's so much censorship, because it's really hard to get people to talk openly. Just from my own travels around the country and talking to people, it's a real mixed bag. You have people who say that, you know, the economic cost is just becoming too much for them and they really need something to change. On the other hand, you have people who say that they're really grateful that the government is protecting them from this virus that they're so scared of. So it is quite a mixed bag. But of course, if the economic pain continues, we'll have to see what takes precedent.
And is it anxiety provoking for you on a personal basis, living in all this?
So I'm in Beijing, and to enter any sort of public space in Beijing, you have to take a COVID test every 72 hours. If you travel around, if you leave Beijing, for example, and go to another city, you have no idea if some cases might pop up in that city, and then that will make it very difficult, if not impossible, for you to return to Beijing. You know, you see all these stories of people who were just desperate for a vacation, and then they went to Hainan, they went to Tibet, and then cases popped up there, and so now they've been stuck there. So definitely traveling around is quite anxiety-inducing.
Vivian, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Vivian Wang is the China correspondent for the New York Times based in Beijing. The United Kingdom is the world's first country to approve a vaccine targeting both the original strain of COVID-19 and the BA1 subvariant of Omicron. That's the first subvariant that emerged. Scientists are now working on another booster that will work on all variants. the holy grail of COVID vaccine development. Sanjaya Senanayake is an Associate Professor of Medicine at the Australian National University and an infectious diseases physician. Welcome back to The Virus, Sanjaya.
Oh, good to be back, Norman.
Let's start with the composite, the so-called bivalent vaccine that the British have approved. Bivalent meaning it's got two versions of the virus in it. We just missed the boat here. I mean, is there any point to this vaccine?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, Norman. So we've always been behind the eight ball because the coronavirus keeps surprising us because of all the mutations. And they have looked at this in a preprint study where they've given about 400 people who've had 3 doses of the mRNA vaccine, 400 people in each group who've had 3 doses of the Moderna vaccine, this extra booster, one of which is just the normal booster with the ancestral strain of the coronavirus, and the other which is bivalent, which has got the BA1 Omicron version. And they did find, not surprisingly, if you get the dose of vaccine which has the Omicron strain in it, compared to the other vaccine, you will get much higher levels of neutralizing antibodies against Omicron. But then they looked at it against BA4 and BA5, and BA5 is the dominant strain in Australia at the moment. And yes, it did produce an antibody response, but not a particularly strong one. So to answer your question, the role of it here in Australia probably isn't very certain at all, particularly as we're coming out of our winter coronavirus outbreak.
And the Americans are pushing for a trivalent vaccine, if you like. They're wanting BA1 and BA5 in a vaccine as well. And that might be the same story, again, missing the boat.
Well, that's right. So the FDA, in fact, said, look, we see what the UK is doing with this Omicron BA1 bivalent vaccine, but we don't want to do that. We expect to have a BA4 or BA5 vaccine ready by our autumn, and we're going to use that. But as you say, the coronavirus just keeps mutating. So optimistically, I could say that BA5 is the most transmissible, most immune evasive variant or subvariant that we've seen so far, and perhaps it will hang around for longer. But then again, Omicron appeared out of the blue. We don't know where it came from. If you look at the sewer systems in New York earlier this year, scientists were looking for evidence of human COVID, but they found sequences of COVID-19 that had never been isolated from humans before. So I think it's very likely that a new subvariant will appear. And you're right, the new BA1 or BA4, BA5 vaccines may not be particularly relevant and may be somewhat redundant.
And we're lucky in a sense that these are still subvariants of Omicron, and so there is a bit of cross-fertilization, if you like, or cross-immunity between them. The next variant might have nothing whatsoever to do with Omicron. How close are we or far away are we from what they're calling, excuse me for the technical term, it's called a pan-sarcoidovirus vaccine. In other words, a vaccine that's going to knock off any future variant that might emerge that might emerge. How far away are we from that?
We're certainly testing for it. My understanding is in terms of getting not necessarily one that goes against all beta coronaviruses, but maybe different variants of COVID. We've got one in clinical trials at the moment that the Walter Reed Military Institute or Army Institute in the US has developed. And my understanding is that at a microscopic level, it looks like a soccer ball. It's got multiple little faces, and each face representing a spike protein. And the idea being that if you give that particular vaccine with those different types of spike protein faces, it will give you cross-immunity against a large variety of COVID viruses. But in terms of the broader SARS-CoV-virus vaccines that you're talking about, that includes beta coronaviruses, so not just COVID, the COVID virus, but the virus that caused SARS about 20 years ago, MERS, and potentially 2 viruses that are responsible for a big bulk of the common cold. We are getting there. So in North Carolina, for instance, they have developed in the laboratory setting a vaccine which uses mRNA technology, and I think they've mishmashed all this.
So the question then is, will these vaccines be what they call sterilizing vaccines? In other words, protect you against infection in the first place? You know, that wonderful place we were a year ago, it feels like 10 years ago, where the vaccines actually protected you against infection, they don't anymore. And to get through this pandemic and out the other side, we need a vaccine that's going to stop the infection.
Yep, that's right. And that particular virus may not necessarily do it. It may be very good at reducing the number of infections, and it may be extremely good at preventing severe illness. But if we want sterilizing immunity, we need to have vaccines that address what we call mucosal immunity. So antibodies in the nose and the throat, for instance, we call them IgA antibodies. Intranasal vaccines are one way of doing that, and I think there are about 12 vaccines in different phases of production against COVID that are intranasal vaccines. I think 4 are in clinical trials at the moment. But yes, so you'd want ideally a broad beta coronis vaccine that can induce sterilizing immunity. So there may be an intranasal one, there may be an injection too.
Sanjaya, thank you yet again for coming on to The Virus.
Thanks, Norman.
Well, over to you now. Here's Penny Timms from the ABC Specialist Reporting Team answering your questions.
How long will I test positive once I get COVID?
This is really a case-by-case scenario. Everybody is different, and that's why making a blanket statement is just so difficult. To complicate matters, it will also depend on the test that you use. For example, if you use a rapid antigen, you're much more likely to only show a positive reading while you're at your most infectious. And there can be exceptions, but that's generally the rule. And that's because those tests detect quite specific proteins on the surface of the virus, whereas a PCR test detects the virus's genetic material, which is a lot more broad and as a result is much more sensitive. Now, what we've seen with the Omicron variants is that a person's infectious period is a lot less than the original strain. And that's why the health advice in many states and territories is to now isolate for 7 days. And so long as you don't have symptoms at the end of the 7 days, you're free to leave.
Why do we have to wait 3 months to get a jab after infection if you can get reinfected within weeks?
The reason why people are advised to wait 3 months after infection before getting a COVID vaccine, be it your primary schedule or booster, is pretty much a numbers game. Vaccines have already shown to reduce severe illness, and according to ATAGI, which is the group that advises the government on these issues, the rationale for waiting is based on expert advice about what will provide you with the most robust vaccine protection. Soon after these vaccines were released, we saw both clinical studies and also community observations, mostly from overseas, which showed that having a gap between an infection and a vaccination generally provided you with a better immune response and longer protection from reinfection than if you had a jab in a shorter time frame.
What should you do if you catch COVID on your travels?
The general rule of thumb is you have to abide by the rules where you are. So this does mean you should think about what you would do if you got sick while you're away from home, and you should factor that into your plans. Now, if you're overseas, this is obviously much more complicated than domestic travel. Thankfully, every country I've looked at has its own information website for travellers, and those sites set out the rules and expectations of visitors when it comes to everything from mask wearing to testing and what to do if you end up with COVID. You really should look up that information before you go, and part of that information and your research should look at travel insurance. From my own experience, you need to be really careful about this because not all plans cover for COVID-related interruptions or illnesses, and a lot of plans only cover certain countries. I found probably the most useful information to be on the federal government Smart Traveller website, and also some countries have mandatory insurance cover which they will make you purchase as part of your visa. My only other advice is to make sure that you have copies of all of your documents and that you download your federal vaccination certificate or exemption.
And if there's something in particular you would like to know, go to the coronavirus section of the ABC News website. And that's the show for this week. Thanks for your company. I'm Norman Swan. Bye for now.